Halloween night. A time for tricks, a time for treats. This year something felt different. An eerie calm hung in the air. The streets were unusually quiet. Even the children seemed hesitant to knock on doors. Perhaps it was the heavy downpour that kept everyone inside. Or maybe it was the unsettling feeling that something sinister lurked just beyond the shadows. As the hours passed, the doorbell cameras captured strange and unsettling images. Costumes became more grotesque. Smiles turned into menacing grins. The usual playful banter of trick-or-treaters was replaced with an unsettling silence. At 123 Maple Drive, a group of children dressed as zombies approached the front door. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes vacant and hollow. They rang the doorbell and waited, their bodies swaying slightly in the rain. When the door remained closed, they let out a low, guttural moan and shuffled away into the night. On Elm Street, a lone figure dressed in a long black cloak and a wide-brimmed hat approached a house. The figure rang the doorbell and waited, its face obscured by the shadows of the hat. When the homeowner answered, the figure slowly lifted its head, revealing a pale, gaunt face with glowing red eyes. The homeowner slammed the door shut and fumbled with the lock, their heart pounding in their chest. The figure continued to stand at the door, a faint scratching sound emanating from beneath its cloak. The doorbell cameras continued to capture the escalating horror. On Oak Avenue, a creature that defied description appeared on a doorstep. It was a mass of tentacles and teeth, its body covered in pulsating sores. The homeowner, alerted by the doorbell camera, watched in terror as the creature attempted to force its way into the house. The homeowner grabbed a nearby umbrella and poked at the creature through the partially opened door. The creature let out a deafening roar before retreating into the night. At the end of the cul-de-sac, a group of teenagers huddled together, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. They were watching the live feeds from the doorbell cameras, their laughter echoing through the empty street. "This is so messed up!" one of the teenagers said, his eyes glued to his phone screen. "I can't believe what I'm seeing!" Another teenager shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "It's creepy," she said. "I don't like it." As they watched, the teenagers noticed something strange happening on one of the camera feeds. The camera was pointing at the front door of a house, but the view was obscured by something dark and moving. The teenagers leaned closer to the screen, their eyes widening in horror as the dark figure resolved itself into a woman. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and she was clearly terrified. Her hair was matted with rain, her clothes were torn, and she was covered in blood. She was holding her hand over her mouth as if trying to stifle a scream. The teenagers watched in stunned silence as the woman stumbled towards the camera, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out a trembling hand as if she was trying to say something, but no words came out. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. The teenagers stared at the screen, their hearts pounding in their chests. What had they just witnessed? Who was that woman, and what had happened to her? They tried to rewind the footage, but the woman was gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. As the night wore on, the doorbell cameras continued to capture horrifying scenes. Monsters of all shapes and sizes roamed the streets, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The air was filled with the sounds of screams and the sickening crunch of bones. The teenagers watched in horror as the city they knew and loved descended into chaos. They knew they had to do something, but what? They were just kids. What could they possibly do to stop this nightmare? Then, just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, the power went out. The teenagers' phones went dark, plunging them into darkness. They huddled together, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They were trapped, alone in the darkness with the monsters. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was the woman from the doorbell camera. She was back, and she was in trouble. Section 4, City of the Undead. The teenagers exchanged terrified glances. They had to help her, but how could they? They were just kids. They didn't stand a chance against whatever was out there. But they couldn't just leave her to die. It was then that they heard it, a low guttural moan coming from the street outside. The teenagers froze, their blood running cold. The moan was getting closer. It was coming from right outside the door. The teenagers huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't human. The news reports were no longer reporting on the strange occurrences, but were now broadcasting urgent warnings of a full-scale zombie invasion. The anchors, their faces pale and voices trembling, urged people to stay indoors, lock their doors, and seek shelter. The city was in chaos. Section 5. A city underwater. The military, caught off guard by the sheer scale and ferocity of the zombie onslaught, struggled to contain the undead horde. Tanks rumbled through the deserted streets, their cannons blazing but to no avail. The zombies, driven by an insatiable hunger, simply kept coming, their decaying bodies impervious to bullets. Helicopters roared overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of zombies. One by one, they were shot out of the sky, crashing in fiery explosions that illuminated the nightmarish scene below. And then, as if the horrors of the night weren't enough, the unthinkable happened. A deafening roar shook the city to its core, and the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. Buildings swayed precariously, their foundations crumbling under the onslaught. Cracks spiderwebbed across sidewalks and streets, splitting the concrete like shattered glass. Panicked screams filled the air as people stumbled and fell, their eyes wide with terror. The city, once a beacon of civilization, was being torn apart at the seams. Section 6. Floating in the moonlight. The monstrous wave, a towering wall of black water, crashed upon the city, swallowing everything in its path. Buildings crumbled and collapsed like sandcastles, their steel and concrete no match for the raw power of nature. Cars were tossed about like toys, their horns blaring in a cacophony of despair. The screams of the living were cut short as the relentless water engulfed them, dragging them down into its depths. The city, once alive with light and sound, was now a tomb, shrouded in darkness and silence. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind a scene of utter devastation. Buildings were reduced to rubble, their skeletal remains reaching towards the sky like grasping claws. Cars lay overturned and mangled, their paint scratched and dented, their windows shattered. Debris littered the streets, a jumbled mess of wood, metal, and concrete. And then, in the eerie silence that followed the storm, a new horror emerged. From the depths of the flooded city, they rose. The waterlogged zombies, their decaying flesh bloated and discolored, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, emerged from the murky depths. They moved slowly, their limbs stiff and uncoordinated, but their hunger was no less ravenous. They stumbled through the wreckage, their moans echoing through the ruined streets, their eyes fixed on the few survivors who had managed to escape the flood. The city, once a place of life and hope, was now a graveyard, a watery tomb for the living and the undead alike.